Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Enchanted from 2007. Enchanted is sort of interesting in terms of Disney and sort of its post-Shrek refiguring of itself in terms of fairy tales. And the 2000s, let's say, were not the greatest decade for Disney animation. They didn't really know what they were doing, and they clearly weren't making a lot of princess movies, although they made Princess and the Frog, which obviously is really great, but that I would say that's more of trying to be a normal princess film and not trying to do after Shrek had happened, where you had a very knowing princess film and you almost had to acknowledge the fault in the whole plot of a Disney princess movie. And so thus you have the scene in Frozen where it's like, you wanted to marry a man you just met. Tangled does that as well, and even Moana, and I'm sure there's like 20 other examples or whatever. But Enchanted is sort of the first version of that from Disney, but it's sort of not an animated. It's animated, but it's not like, it's live action for the most part. And it is actually directed by, started out as an animation director, Kevin Lima, who I guess because he had done some Eloise shorts, I'm not really sure, TV movies or something, that were live action, and he had directed Tarzan and a Goofy movie. He probably was someone on the payroll who could do that. And so Enchanted is about a princess, a maiden, who is going to marry a prince, but his evil stepmother, played by Susan Sarandon, almost too perfectly, sends her through a portal to the real world where there are no happy endings or whatever. And she comes to New York City, in Times Square, the most touristy part of New York City, of course, and then meets a man played by Patrick Dempsey, who falls in love with her as he is very practical, very realistic kind of guy, and she's very fantastical, being a princess and all that stuff. And then her prince comes to try to find her, played by very perfectly by James Marsden, and tries to hook up. And as Patrick Dempsey and Amy Adams sort of fall in love as he is attracted to her not being so practical, and has actually something in common with her. I'm not exactly sure. I think it's more of an opposites attract thing, whatever. Enchanted, I'd never seen it, believe it or not, before this time. For some reason, I didn't see it in the 2000s. I was probably, I just got out of art school. This wasn't sort of the thing I was going to see then. Unlike now, I'd probably just been like, oh, cool, a movie. I find this film interesting. I don't really get how I've heard people get really excited about it and still talk about it. I don't know if it really, after I saw it, I didn't really ever need to see it again necessarily, and I find it sort of an interesting place in the film history of Disney and kind of the cynical nature of how we've perceived fairy tales and so forth, particularly after Shrek, or post-Shrek, as I refer to all society after 2001. But I think it does it in a lot more natural way than those films did. If you look at Frozen and Tangled and all those movies, they are Disney princess films where they acknowledge it within the princess movie itself. This is taking itself out of that into the real world, where you would naturally say hey, that's weird because I live in real world and you don't and stuff. And that's sort of like the whole crux of the movie, but it does these kind of big musical numbers, which it does fairly well. It doesn't sort of a 2000s-y Hollywood way, very much so, but it shows kind of how good that can possibly be. This was sort of the biggest breakout of Amy Adams, which I think people don't acknowledge, but I've heard her say in several interviews, although she'd been Oscar nominated for Junebug, which she is very excellent in. Junebug's a great movie. More people should see it. Although that was kind of like the very beginning of her, really. This is the thing that made people go, oh, we can have her star in stuff, because after this she was starring in all sorts of things, and it also helped that she is a very good dramatic actress. And if you look at what she did in Junebug, it sort of makes sense for this, although Junebug's a much darker movie, obviously, than this. But she's really good at doing the big songs, appealing to little girls, having that optimism, and I think she does it even better than people like, Jennifer Garner did a few years before this one, in 13 going on 30. It's very genuine in a way I don't think a lot of people can do, and she plays off that kind of arc of it very well. And I think, this has an amazing kind of cast, actors who are very game for things, who are very happy being a character actor or a lead or so forth. James Marsden as the prince is absolutely perfect in this. I think James Marsden probably has a better range than anyone will ever give him credit for. He's a very talented actor, but at the time it probably felt more radical. Now it's like, oh yeah, of course James Marsden can do that. But he's very good at playing that as well as Susan Sarandon, who's excellent. The one surprise, and while I was watching it, we watched this as a family, and I was like, I feel like someone big is going to be the girlfriend. And I had no clue who the girlfriend, Patrick Dempsey's girlfriend, who he keeps talking about for a few scenes. And then then Idina Menzel shows up, and I go, oh, of course she's gonna sing a song. She doesn't. Like, why is she in this? That's weird. Like, did she have a song cut? I couldn't find anything, but it's like, why did you have Idina Menzel? It's weird she was in a Disney movie pre-Frozen. That's strange. But then I thought, like, oh, you're gonna have her do the big number where she's like, does he love me or something? And no, Amy Adams does that. I don't know what you guys were thinking with that one, but, you know, in retrospect, that was stupid. But at the time, like, I think Rent and Wicked had already happened, so I don't know, like, and Patrick Dempsey sort of, like, was big at the time. I'm not a huge Patrick Dempsey fan. I don't think I think you probably could have gotten someone a little more charismatic. In terms of, like, kind of the cynical nature of fairy tale stuff, it's fine at what it's doing. I think in a lot of ways these kind of films are more cast dependent than anyone will acknowledge. Look at Sonic the Hedgehog, for example. When you have Susan Sarandon, James Marsden, and Amy Adams, this film's going to be, you know, just fun to watch. In general, Susan Sarandon doesn't get as much to do. I would just watch the whole movie with her because she's amazing, but she does a good job. I do think a lot of this film, when I started to love it, like the working song and like How Does She Know, I think, there's like a lot of songs in this. That's How You Know was kind of interesting. I like the working song, but it does like kind of get into like, it is gross if she had rats and things like that. This is directed by Kevin Lima, who had directed Tarzan, Goofy Movie. I don't find him to be he just directs in kind of a big studio way. He's not, you know, if I hadn't looked this director up, I wouldn't have found this direction very interesting. His career is interesting, but this is not very well, you know, amazingly well directed or something like that. I think Enchanted is kind of like an interesting footnote. It is also interesting that Disney, the only way they could like sort of acknowledge like, well, what do we do now that everyone's cynical about fairy tales? Oh, we'll not do an official Disney animated thing. We'll do this sort of separate thing that's sort of like, it's under the Disney banner. People know Disney made it, it has Disney animation in it, but it's not, you know, one of the features and so forth, which is sort of like weak sauce in terms of finding a way to really deal with what had happened with Shrek. And I think when these big hits happen, like what happened with Scream, look at what horror movies, it took forever to like make a genuine sort of horror movie. It takes a while to bounce back from those sort of things, you know. It took Disney, although they had animated hits since then, and although I think Princess and the Frog is an excellent movie, I think it took them a way to fully like bounce back from that. And this was sort of an attempt, but I think it's sort of a failed attempt, particularly like the end set piece is very bad. Like I was like, this is very weak in terms of like most set pieces, like people go all out, and it just felt like kind of a rush job at the end. I do think Amy Adams and Patrick Dempsey had genuine chemistry, although when I think about like why he would like her, I think it's because she was so different than what he's used to in terms of his practicalness, and he liked kind of the swept off your feet and love at first sight sort of thing despite that. But I don't know if I understand their relationship, but I definitely got the chemistry which worked, which I think a lot of these films, when you have this kind of fantastical stuff, the actors have to almost like overwork to get these sort of connections to work, because the film and the screenplay really is not. So it is also interesting this was produced by Barry Sodenfeld, which is kind of odd, but I feel like he probably would have done a much more interesting job both directing it and shooting it. But although I find the direction not great in this, and I don't think it's an amazing film, and I don't know, we had to rent it, it wasn't on Disney Plus when we saw it, which I don't understand because my wife really wanted to watch it, and I found this sort of an interesting kind of footnote, but I don't think it is a film that directly gets into it, because it almost feels like they wanted to parody it in a way to say like, oh well, these aren't like real life. And I think that sort of maybe doesn't work entirely. I also think, like, you know, had you had a much more compelling script, it's a fun family film. That's basically what it is. We all had a good time. We had a good night. It wasn't like hard to get through or anything like that. It's just like, that was Enchanted. There's not much discussion to it. You have a lovely time and you leave, but it doesn't make you kind of like questioning it too much, because you're like, oh, well, of course, if they were put in this context, it would be like that. And I think maybe that's sort of why you heard more about that scene in Frozen or Moana, and I've seen less about what comes out of this, because this is, the context is changing and you very much know that, and it doesn't feel necessarily as critical of it. If it had been a full animated film, I think it would have been different with that, but unfortunately it is not a full animated film, although the animation in this is really great, and the flow to it was amazing, and probably some people would say over animated, but I thought it was very good. I really like the animation in it, but I think Enchanted is just not a film you get that excited about. It's just kind of like a big Hollywood sort of answer to something in a lot of ways, and just like a fun sort of, I think this came out around Christmas or whatever, Thanksgiving, why not? One of those. It's a good, fine film to see with the family. And that's sort of all it is. It's kind of one of those Disney family films. It tried to kind of tackle more than that. Clearly, it doesn't really work because you understand that this isn't one of those. And it is separate. And if you put that in there, of course that would happen. And I think it kind of loses that edge that, oddly enough, Shrek had at doing that. I wish they had found a way to like kind of answer the discussion a little bit more in terms of, you know, how they were able to sort of handle something like that. But I think Enchanted is just a lovely kind of big musical 2000s kind of movie, and that's really what it's ultimately trying to accomplish. It tries to do a little bit more than that, but, you know, doesn't work entirely. But in terms of what it's doing in terms of like a big 2000s-y film with an enthusiastic kind of Amy Adams performance, it's lovely at that. And that's sort of what you want from it. It's not painful to watch. It's a nice watch, but I don't think it's the kind of film your family will be watching over and over again, because it just doesn't excite that much passion, because it's directed and made in kind of that kind of almost soulless kind of 2000s studio way. But even though it might not have a soul, it's still an enjoyable time. So if you have seen Enchanted and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.